We've entered a new geographic and spatial territory in the Gospel of Mark. We've seen Jesus and the disciples move from Galilee and the region surrounding Galilee to Jerusalem. One of the major features that will show up again and again in our texts in the coming weeks in really big and significant ways is the temple. The temple, you might know from some of your biblical history, was the center of Jewish ritual life. This is different from the synagogues, for example, where we see Jesus teaching in the region surrounding Galilee. Synagogues were a place where people gathered to hear the scriptures read, to hear teachings about Jewish interpretation of the scriptures, to pray together, to engage in religious community together. These were small places in local towns and cities. There is only one temple. It is in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, a really important geographical location for Mark. You're going to see this showing up in really important ways, so I want you to pay attention to it and what it means for Mark. So a couple of important things I want to note as we move into this. We're going to see Jesus clashing in some very significant ways with Jewish religious leadership. You certainly know the ways that Christian readers of the scripture have read the New Testament in some very anti-Semitic ways over time. There are a few things I think it is important to keep in mind so that we don't kind of even unconsciously lapse into this anti-Semitic and anachronistic reading of Mark. One is that there is no monolithic Judaism in some sense. You will see in this week's text some different factions of Jewish leadership coming into the picture, engaging with Jesus. So there was diversity and disagreement and different traditions growing up within Judaism itself. And very importantly at this point, both in the narrative of Mark and in Mark's own day when he's writing to his community, there was no different religion called Christianity. Christianity was growing out of the larger Jewish tapestry and very significantly related to Judaism for quite a long time. Of course, we know then began to grow into a very Gentile religion. Mark's congregation is probably predominantly Gentile. But the Jewish nature of this movement is very important in interpreting Mark. And seeing how Jesus interacts with the Sadducees in this week's text, you're going to see them ask a question very much rooted in their conservative Jewish theology that was firmly grounded in the Torah, not the later writings and prophets, but the first 5 books of our Old Testament. They're going to ask a question from their specific religious vantage point that makes sense to them to question Jesus. You're going to see Jesus interact with others in the Jewish religious structure, like the scribes. You're even going to see one instance which indicates that Mark does not see the Jewish leadership, which has been conflicting with Jesus throughout the text. Mark does not see the Jewish leadership as a monolith either. You're going to see one very surprising conversation take place this week that's going to be quite interesting, I think, for you to note some of the things that Jesus says in this conversation. If you want to read ahead, we're reading in chapters 11 and 12 of Mark. So one really significant thing you need to understand about Mark is that he is writing sometime around 70 CE. Now, if you know your history of Israel, you know that 70 CE is one of the most significant dates in that history. 70 CE is when the temple, the second temple, is destroyed. This occurred because around 66 CE and all the way up through beyond 70, a group of Jewish revolutionaries, sort of the Zealots, were revolting against Roman occupation of Israel. They wanted to forcibly remove Roman occupiers from their land. I think, a lot of you would probably sympathize with the concerns of the Zealots to be out from under the oppressive rule of an occupying, colonizing force. But of course, the Roman Empire is extraordinarily large and extraordinarily powerful. And the Romans come into Jerusalem for a period, I think, of about 5 or 6 months and just destroy it. I mean, they put down the revolt of the Zealots in a powerful and violent way, and in the process, they destroy the temple. The temple is the central spot, the one geographic and architectural location that is central to all of Judaism. This cannot be more important to note that Mark is writing during a time when the temple either is about to be or likely already has been destroyed. So when we read engagements that Mark is writing about with Jesus in the temple, think not only of what's happening in the narrative, because in Jesus' day the temple still stood, but think also of Mark's audience reading this text when the temple has likely already been destroyed, and how they might hear some of these stories differently, and not just stories that are opposing some of the practices of the sacrificial system and things like that, but questions that emerge for a people whose central feature of religious life has been completely destroyed by their occupying oppressors. How does religious life continue in Judaism and, of course, in Christianity, which is still a very Jewish movement at this point, and the temple is a very important symbol for early Christians too, you see. So how does religious life continue beyond the temple's destruction? This becomes really important for people in Mark's era, and Mark may be trying to address some of those questions for his readers. And you need to understand also that there was a pluriformity of ideas about that within Judaism. Even before the temple was destroyed, there were prophetic notions within Judaism that imaged religious life beyond the sacrificial system of the temple and centered it more in the life of prayer that took place, for example, in synagogues. You'll see that conversation sort of emerging in this week's text in some ways that if you know that was a conversation taking place at the time, you can see how Mark is engaging that conversation in the narrative itself too. So all that to say, pay close attention to how the temple shows up in the next few chapters of Mark. It's going to be very important for understanding what Jesus is saying, what he's doing, how he's setting up how Mark is setting up geographic tensions and messages with where he positions Jesus in relation to the temple and all these sorts of things. You really miss a lot if you don't pay attention to these geographic, topographical, landscape things that Mark is doing in the text itself. So pay attention. The temple is going to be a prime actor in the remainder of Mark's gospel.